We often hear about climate change in the media, but what is climate change and why is it important? To understand climate change, we first need to understand the greenhouse effect and why greenhouse gases are important. The greenhouse effect is a naturally occurring phenomenon in the Earth's atmosphere. As energy from the sun enters the atmosphere, some of this energy is reflected back into outer space and some energy is trapped in the atmosphere. This flow of energy traps enough heat in the atmosphere to allow for life on Earth to flourish. Some energy from the sun is reflected and some stays in the atmosphere as heat. The energy is trapped in the atmosphere partly due to the presence of greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases include water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and others. Human activities are increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Burning coal to generate electricity, burning petrol in cars, some chemical processes in industries, and many farming activities all add to the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The increase in greenhouse gases is causing more and more energy to be trapped in the atmosphere. You can think of the atmosphere as a blanket that is getting thicker and thicker as more greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere. As more energy gets trapped, the atmosphere heats up. This heating up process is referred to as global warming. Increased levels of CO2 and other greenhouse gases trap more heat in the atmosphere. As the Earth's atmosphere gets hotter, there are impacts on how global weather systems work. Some areas will experience large increase in temperature, while others will have less marked increase in temperature. Some areas get more rain, while others get less. These large-scale changes in long-term weather patterns is what is referred to as climate change. Climate change has direct and indirect impacts on the world we live in. The three major direct impacts are increased global temperatures, more variable rainfall, and rising sea levels. Global temperatures are rising due to increased heat being trapped in the atmosphere. These rising temperatures in turn affect the amount and flow of moisture in the atmosphere, which causes changes in rainfall patterns. And as temperatures increase, the oceans expand and more ice and snow melt, resulting in sea level rise. Linked to these direct impacts are a wide range of indirect impacts. Some of these include changes in crop production, impacts on biodiversity, damage to coastal properties, increased spread of diseases, as well as floods and droughts. The purpose of the vulnerability assessment is to look at all these potential impacts and work out which one is most important to your particular area. Climate change is therefore a critical issue that will affect all of us. And because it affects all of us, we all have a role in responding to it. We can begin by clearly understanding what are the priority risks from climate change, and in our area, from there, what kinds of projects and actions can we take to reduce these risks. Now that you understand exactly what climate change is and why it's important to you, this video introduces you to the Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment methodology. This methodology will help you to clearly understand and identify priority risks from climate change in your area. Firstly, what is a climate change vulnerability assessment? As you have seen, there are a wide range of potential impacts from climate change. These impacts can both be positive and negative and occur in different sectors such as agriculture, water, and human settlements. The purpose of a climate change vulnerability assessment is to look at all the potential impacts from climate change and work out which impacts are most important for your specific area. We therefore define a climate change vulnerability assessment as a process used to determine which climate change impacts are most important for your area. There are different ways that you can assess climate change vulnerability. The methodology that is presented here is conducted in 4 steps. In the first step, we aim to identify climate change indicators. In the second step, we assess the exposure of each sector to the indicators. In the third step, we assess the sensitivity of each sector to the indicators. The final step aims to determine the adaptive capacity of the sectors to the potential impacts. This is a relatively standard methodology used to determine climate change vulnerability. And the reason we use it is so that you can compare your vulnerability assessment to other areas in South Africa and around the world. The climate change vulnerability assessment methodology may seem complicated with strange and unfamiliar terms. But as you go through each of these steps in detail in the next couple of videos in the series, these terms and the overall methodology will become clearer. In conclusion, it's important to remember that climate change vulnerability assessment is a process used to determine which climate change indicators are most important for your area. Once all the most important potential impacts from climate change have been determined through the vulnerability assessment, you can then begin developing possible responses and projects to adapt to these impacts. In this video, we're going to look at the first step of the climate change vulnerability assessment, which is identifying climate change indicators. Developing a list of indicators will give you a starting point in identifying all the potential impacts to climate change in your area. You can approach the step by asking the question, what are all the potential impacts from climate change in South Africa? This should cover all key sectors in the country, such as agriculture, water, and human settlements. A list of climate change indicators have been developed through the Let's Respond Toolkit program by summarizing all the potential climate change impacts in South Africa. This list of indicators was developed using the Long-Term Adaptation Scenarios, or LTAS, reports, which have been developed by the Department of Environmental Affairs. This report is an example of a technical report that covers the potential risks and vulnerabilities from climate change of the human settlement sector in South Africa. These reports were developed for all major sectors in the country. There are reports for agriculture, biodiversity, human health, human settlements, water, and a range of cross-cutting issues like disaster management. Each of the LTAS reports provide a summary of the potential impacts from climate change for the sectors in South Africa and highlights some potential adaptation responses. These LTAS reports were summarized into a list of indicators for each sector. This table shows the indicators that have been developed for the human settlement sector as part of the Let's Respond Toolkit program. An example from this list is an indicator, increased impacts on informal dwellings. The indicator description states that informal dwellings and settlements that are often unplanned and without extensive services or infrastructure are vulnerable to climate change impacts. Another example in the human settlement sector is that there will be increased isolation of rural communities resulting from climate change as roads are damaged and there are increased flooding and erosion. A set of indicators have been developed for you through the Let's Respond Toolkit program for the following sectors: agriculture, biodiversity and environment, coastal and marine, health, human settlements, and water. This list of indicators provides the starting point for all the possible climate change impacts that could be experienced in South Africa. It is important to note that indicator lists have been developed as a guideline and a starting point only. If you feel that they are not adequately reflecting your particular area, you are welcome to edit and to add to the indicator listed in the toolkit. The full list of indicators can be downloaded from the Let's Respond Toolkit website, and they are included in the Vulnerability Assessment Excel sheet. Throughout the Vulnerability Assessment video series, we will be referring to the Let's Respond Toolkit website containing useful resources, including the Vulnerability Assessment Excel sheet that you will use when completing the assessment for your area. You have now gone through the first step of the climate change vulnerability assessment, developing a list of all the potential climate change indicators. The next video will detail the second step in the vulnerability assessment, which is to determine whether or not you are exposed to the particular climate change indicator. In this video, you're going to look at the second step of the climate change vulnerability assessment, which helps you to determine whether or not you're exposed to the climate change indicators in the list. You can approach the second step by asking yourself, will this particular impact take place in my area, or will I be exposed to this particular climate change indicator? You usually answer this exposure question with a yes or a no answer. Let's look at an exposure example using the downloaded Excel vulnerability assessment sheet. When you open the sheet, column C lists all the climate change indicators which have been determined for each sector. Column D provides a detailed description of the indicators. Moving across the columns, you will see the different vulnerability assessment steps. We will focus on the exposure columns for now. Let's take an example from the human settlement sector. One of the indicators in the sector is that climate change will result in increased impacts on informal dwellings. The indicator description states that already vulnerable dwellings and settlements that are often unplanned and without extensive services or infrastructure are vulnerable to climate change. The exposure question in column E reads, do you have informal dwellings in your area? You can respond to this question using resources available on the Let's Respond Toolkit website and your own knowledge of the area. There are various maps and indicators and reports which link directly to each of the indicators. These can help guide you in answering each of the steps in the vulnerability assessment. Here you can see an example of a human settlements map, which can be used when responding to some of the questions. You can zoom into your particular area or municipality and click on the map for more information. You can also use the long-term adaptation scenarios reports for each of the sectors. This is the report for the human settlement sector and provides detailed technical information on the potential impacts of climate change on the human settlement sector. Now, to get back to our example, let's say your response to the question, do you have informal dwellings in your area, is yes. You can go ahead and add this response to column F. If your answer was no, you would then add your response by typing in no to the same column. In the next column, to the right, column G, you can add any additional comments to support or elaborate your response. It is a good idea to include comments here so that when other stakeholders review your plan, they can understand why you have answered this question as a yes or a no. Let's look at another example in the agriculture sector. One of the indicators in this sector is increased risk to livestock. The indicator description states that decreases in rainfall and herbage yields will result in negative impacts for livestock. Again, using our knowledge of the area or resources such as census data, LTAS reports from the Let's Respond Toolkit website, you can then respond with either a yes or a no answer. You have now gone through steps 1 and 2 of the climate change vulnerability assessment. You have developed a list of climate change indicators through step 1 and have assessed whether your area will be exposed to these indicators by answering yes or no in step 2. In the next video, we move on to step 3 of the vulnerability assessment, which helps you to determine how sensitive your area is to the different climate change indicators. In this video, you're going to look at the third step of the vulnerability assessment, which will help you to determine how sensitive your area is to the climate change indicators. You can approach this third step by asking yourself, if the impact takes place, how important will the impact be? You usually answer the sensitivity question using a rating of high, medium, or low. Let's look at the sensitivity example using the downloaded Excel vulnerability assessment sheet. As we saw previously, when you open the Excel sheet, column C lists all the climate change indicators which have been determined for each sector. Moving across the columns, you will see the different vulnerability assessment steps. We will focus on the sensitivity columns for now. Let's take the same example from the human settlement sector we used in the exposure exercise. Increased impacts on informal dwellings. You will remember that the indicator description states that already vulnerable dwellings and settlements that are often unplanned and without extensive service or infrastructure are vulnerable to climate change impacts. The sensitivity question in column K reads, What percentage of households are informal dwellings in your area? You will also see that below this question there is a rating of high, medium or low. For this indicator, if you have more than 15% of households that are informal dwellings, you are highly sensitive. If the number of households that are informal dwellings are between 10 and 15%, you have medium sensitivity. And if less than 10% of households are informal dwellings, you have low sensitivity. These sensitivity ratings in the toolkit were determined using the national census data, various health stats, and sector reports. The national averages were considered as the medium scores, while anything higher than the averages were rated as high, and scores lower than the averages rated as low. You can score your area as high, medium or low for this sensitivity question using resources available from the Let's Respond Toolkit website and your own knowledge or research of the area. There are various maps and indicator tables and reports which link directly to each of the indicators. These can help guide you in answering each of the steps of the vulnerability assessment. Here we can see an example of indicator stats from the website for district municipalities in the Free State. This particular tool on the Let's Respond Toolkit lets you select different municipalities and provides the scores you need to fill in for some of the sensitivity questions in your sheet. Let's say in your area, the percentage of households that are informal dwellings are 16%. This would mean that you score high on the sensitivity rating because you're higher than 15%. You can then go on and add the response high in the column L. If your answer was medium or low, you would then add your responses by typing in medium or low in the same column. In the next column to the right, column M, you can add any additional comments to support or elaborate on your responses. It is a good idea to include comments here so that other stakeholders review your plans and understand as to why you answered high, medium or low. In this example, you can just type in 16% households in informal dwellings. Let's look at another example in the agriculture sector. One of the indicators in this sector is increased risk to livestock. The indicator description states that decreases in rainfall and herbage yields will result in negative health impacts for livestock. The sensitivity question here is, how important is livestock farming to the local economy and livelihoods? The answers are high priority, medium priority, low or no priority. For this question, you will need to consult research and key stakeholders to find out how important livestock farming is for your area. Based on this, you can then decide whether it is high, medium, or of low sensitivity. Let's say we've consulted with stakeholders and determined that livestock farming is of high importance. You can then score sensitivity as high in column L and add in your reason in column M, which could be there are high levels of subsistence farming in the area. You then follow the same process and respond to all the sensitivity questions with either high, medium or low for the different indicators. It is important to remember that only do the sensitivity step for the indicators that you responded yes to for exposure. If you responded no for exposure, you can just ignore the indicator going forward because you are not affected by this particular climate change impact in your area. So to recap, in step 1 of the vulnerability assessment, you develop the list of all the potential climate change indicators. In the second step, you assessed whether you will be exposed to each of these indicators. In the third step, you assessed how sensitive you are to the indicators you're exposed to. Exposure and sensitivity together determine your potential climate change impacts. So if you answered yes to exposure and high to sensitivity, then you can expect impacts linked to particular indicators. In the next video, we move on to step 4 of the vulnerability assessment, which helps you to determine whether you're able to adapt to these potential impacts from climate change. In this video, you're going to look at the fourth step of the vulnerability assessment, which will help you to determine what your adaptive capacity is towards these potential climate change impacts. You can approach this fourth step by asking yourself, do I have systems in place to respond to the impact? You usually answer this adaptive capacity question using a rating of either high, medium, or low. Let's look at an adaptive capacity example using the downloaded Excel vulnerability assessment sheet. As we saw previously, when you open the Excel sheet, column C lists all the climate change indicators which have been determined for each sector. Moving across the columns, you will see the different vulnerability assessment steps. We will focus on the adaptive capacity columns for now, from column P onwards. Let's take the same example from the human settlement sector we used in the exposure and sensitivity exercises. Increased impacts on informal dwellings. You'll remember that the indicator description states that already vulnerable dwellings and settlements that are often unplanned and without extensive service or infrastructure are vulnerable to climate change impacts. The adaptive capacity question in column P reads, do you have high, medium, or low adaptive capacity to respond to increased impacts on informal dwellings? To assess adaptive capacity, you need to consider the following combination of criteria. The first is research. Is there research being conducted that will assist you to respond to the potential climate change impact? The second is policy. Do you have any policies or regulations in place that will assist you in adapting to the potential climate change impact? The third is institutional support. Do you have staff or are there organizations that can help you to respond to potential climate change impacts? The fourth is finances. Do you have budget available to implement the necessary projects needed to respond to potential climate change impact? This overall adaptive capacity rating is determined by reaching a consensus during stakeholder consultations. You will discuss the different components of adaptive capacity and decide whether you have high, medium, or low capacity in place to respond to a potential climate change impact. The adaptive capacity ratings are as follows. High means you have systems in place to respond to potential climate change impact. Medium adaptive capacity means there are some systems in place to respond to the potential impact. For example, you may have staff but no budget. Low adaptive capacity means there are no or limited systems in place to respond to potential climate change impacts. Now, to get back to our example, if we consider the human settlement sector indicator, increased impacts on informal dwellings, the adaptive capacity question is, do you have adaptive capacity to respond to increased impact on informal dwellings? To this question, you would then need to consult stakeholders and try to answer the following questions. Is there local research on informal dwellings risks? Are there robust policies and programs in place to deal with informal dwellings? Are there institutional systems to deal with informal dwellings? Is there financial support for informal dwellings programs? Let's say that through the stakeholder consultation process, you found that there is a relocation strategy that is in place and research being conducted by a particular institution on informal dwellings vulnerability to climate change. But there is limited funding for implementation. Based on this evaluation, you may then decide, because there are systems in place, your adaptive capacity is medium for this impact. You can then go ahead and add medium as your response in column Q. If your answer was low, you would then add low in the same column. In the next column to the right, column R, you can add any additional comments to support or elaborate on your response. As mentioned before, it is always a good idea to include comments here so that when other stakeholders review your plans, they can understand why you've answered this question in a particular way. Let's look at another example in the agriculture sector. One of the indicators in this sector is increased risk to livestock. The adaptive capacity question here is, do you have high, medium, or low adaptive capacity to respond to increased risk to livestock? Through your stakeholder consultations, you may identify that there is no research on the impacts of climate change on livestock in the area, and there are no policies to deal with this issue. There is some capacity at the provincial level in the Agriculture Department, but there is no budget available. You would then score yourself as having low adaptive capacity. You then follow the same process and respond to all the adaptive capacity questions with either high, medium, or low for the different indicators. It is important to remember that you only do the adaptive capacity step for the indicators that you responded yes to for exposure and high or medium for the sensitivity question. If you responded no for exposure or low to sensitivity, you can just ignore the indicator going forward because you are not highly affected by this particular climate change impact in your area. So to recap, in step 1 of the vulnerability assessment, you developed your list of potential climate change indicators. In the second step, you assessed whether you're exposed to each of these indicators. In the third step, you assessed how sensitive you are to the indicators you are exposed to. Exposure and sensitivity together determine your potential climate change impacts. In this fourth step, you then assessed your adaptive capacity to respond to the potential impacts. Finally, if you have low adaptive capacity, you are vulnerable to that particular indicator. In this video, we're going to look at how you can use the climate change vulnerability assessment to develop a list of priority climate change indicators. These are critical areas that will require responses in order for you to minimize your risk and vulnerability to climate change. You will remember that when you started the climate change vulnerability assessment, you developed a complete list of climate change indicators for each sector in South Africa. You will also remember that a climate change vulnerability assessment is a process used to determine which climate change impacts are most important for your area. In order to prioritize your most important indicators, you began excluding indicators that were not relevant or important. Those indicators that you answered no to for exposure implies that you did not expect the particular indicator to take place in your area. Those that you answered low or medium to for the sensitivity question implies that the indicators are not relevant or of only medium importance to your area. And those that you responded high or medium for adaptive capacity implies that you have some systems in place already to respond to the potential impact. Through the short listing process, you are now left with the indicators that are a priority for your area. You should therefore make a list of the indicators that you scored the following for: yes for exposure, high for sensitivity, low for adaptive capacity. We went through the two examples in the previous videos. These were increased impacts on informal dwellings and increased risk to livestock. For the first example, increased impacts on informal dwellings, you scored yes for exposure, high for sensitivity, and medium for adaptive capacity. This is not a priority indicator because you scored medium for adaptive capacity. So there are systems in place to deal with this issue. For the second example, increased risk to livestock, you scored yes for exposure, high for sensitivity, and low for adaptive capacity. This is a priority indicator because this is an important and sensitive issue and you have no capacity to respond to it. Remember, the aim of the climate change vulnerability assessment is to determine which climate change impacts are most important to you. These are the impacts that are potentially significant or have high sensitivity and there is currently limited adaptive capacity to respond to the potential impact. The next step involved shortlisting these potential impacts to a list of most critical indicators through a prioritization exercise. You have now gone through the entire vulnerability assessment, having started with an extensive list of climate change indicators and ending up with a list of priority indicators for your area. Conducting a climate change vulnerability assessment is only a part of a process in preparing for climate change. The next step is to begin identifying projects and responses to the priority indicators. These responses can be summarized in your climate change response plan. And from there, you need to make sure that that the results from your climate change response plan are integrated into your municipal IDP and spatial development plan.
This video provides an introduction to what a climate change response plan is and how this plan can be developed using an existing template that has been developed as part of this program. This template can be downloaded from the program website. To start, what exactly is a climate change response plan and why do you need one? A climate change response plan is a document that summarizes what your potential impacts from climate change are and how you can respond to these potential impacts. Climate change response plans are useful because they summarize all the climate change issues in one place, and the process also of developing this can help identify key stakeholders you need on board in order to respond to climate change. Climate change response plans generally follow a similar structure. This includes an executive summary, some kind of statement of the methodology used in developing the plan, a summary of background information on climate change and of your particular area, key climate change priorities or vulnerabilities, and how you're going to respond to them. The first section of this plan should introduce the reader to the purpose of the plan and how you went about developing it. This introduction should include a summary of what the plan contains and why you've developed it. The provided template has an introductory chapter that you can use as a starting point for developing your own plan. The methodology chapter should include the process you followed in developing the plan. You can talk about how you went about conducting a climate change vulnerability assessment, how projects were identified, and how stakeholders were engaged. You'll see that the template has a methodology chapter that summarizes the vulnerability assessment process and how projects were selected. This can also be used as a starting point for your plan. The background information chapter is a literature review of different policies, relevant municipal statistics, and climate change related information used in the development of the plan. If there's an existing provincial climate change plan, this can be summarized in this section. You can also include a summary of key municipal development issues and municipal climate change related indicators. The template includes a provincial summary as well as some background information on district municipalities. Once you've completed the introductory chapter of the report, it's important to summarize the key climate change issues for your particular area. If you've already conducted a climate change vulnerability assessment, the results from this can then be included here. If you haven't done a climate change vulnerability assessment yet, it's strongly advised that you complete one. You can review some of the other toolkit videos which guide you through this process. You'll see that the template breaks the section up into sub-chapters per sector, for example, agriculture, health, biodiversity, and so on. And each sector includes an introduction to the chapter as well as the results from the vulnerability assessment. A summary from the entire vulnerability assessment is then provided at the end. The final part of the plan are the responses and the projects you've identified to address your priority climate change indicators. In this section, it's important to make a direct link between the priority climate change indicators as well as the projects that you're proposing. This can be done by developing project names that talk directly to your indicators. In the slide, we see how the priority indicator, Increased Impacts of Informal Settlements, becomes a project titled Manage Potential Increased Impacts on Informal Settlements. Projects are quite high-level interventions and they need a set of sub-projects to be implementable. These sub-projects are the kind of projects that are measurable and can be included as budget line into the IDP. When defining sub-projects, try to consider the following. Firstly, begin with an action word such as draft, implement, facilitate, or commission research. Secondly, be as specific as possible. For example, draft an alien invasive eradication plan for a particular community. Thirdly, avoid being too vague. For example, saying improve infrastructure. The sub-projects must be affordable and also be implementable with current staff and timeframes. The Climate Change Response Plan template includes a chapter per sector for the proposed projects and their associated sub-projects. There's an introduction per sector which contains key climate change issues in the sector, and then a page per project which include the projects as well as the sub-projects to go with these responses. Once you've completed your responses, you can go back to the beginning of the document to complete the executive summary. The executive summary should provide a short introduction to the overall response plan, highlighting why climate change is important in your particular area. It should also summarize your priority climate change indicators, possibly in a table, and also list the proposed projects and responses. When you develop the executive summary, try to be concise with text that can easily be pasted into other documents, such as the Integrated Development Plan, as well as the Spatial Development Framework. The Climate Change Response Plan template provides a guide and a structure that you can use for an executive summary. So, you've now gone through the basic structure of drafting a climate change response plan. It's important to remember that the plan is only as good as the content you include in it, and whether your key stakeholders have participated in this development. The next chapter in this series discusses how to get the right stakeholders to input into your climate change planning process. This video is going to focus on how you can go about integrating your climate change response plan into your Integrated Development Plan, also known as an IDP. In order to integrate your climate change response plan into your IDP, the following 4 steps can be followed. The first step is to assess whether your IDP is climate change credible and whether the key outcomes of your climate change response plan are reflected in the IDP. The second step is to ensure your newly developed climate change responses and projects are represented in the Service Delivery and Budget Implementation Plan and Medium-Term Expenditure Framework budget allocations of your municipality. The third step requires you to communicate the municipal response to the community. And the final step is the actual project and program implementation and monitoring. Let's look at each of these steps in more detail. The first step in this process aims to assess whether your existing IDP is climate change credible. This process allows you to check your municipality's IDP and determine whether it already includes climate change issues in each of the key areas. A checklist has been developed for this review process and is included in the Let's Respond Toolkit guide. The checklist looks at different climate change assessment criteria under key sectors and asks whether or not these particular criteria are covered in the IDP. This is what the climate change credibility checklist looks like. Section 1 focuses on assessing the spatial development analysis and rationale components of your IDP. The first question is, does the municipality exhibit a good understanding of areas vulnerable to the impact of climate change, as well as extreme weather events? The second section considers infrastructure planning, particularly in the water sector. One of the questions here is, does the IDP's vision or mission cover future-related water resources and water services issues, and does this include consideration of future climate change impacts? The column to the right provides you with the space to answer yes or no to the question and add any comments that may be useful going forward. The other sections in the assessments include service delivery and infrastructure planning, local economic development, good governance, financial viability, as well as institutional arrangements. You can download the full assessment tool from the Let's Respond Toolkit website. Once you have conducted your climate change credibility assessment, you might decide that your newly developed climate change plan is not adequately reflected in the IDP. It is vitally important that the areas of highest vulnerability and associated projects that you've listed in your climate change plan are incorporated into your IDP so that they can be prioritized when allocating budgets. If you've used the templates provided through the Let's Respond Toolkit, there are 2 main areas where the text from these plans can be easily included in your IDP. The first is to include a generic introduction statement about climate change and why it is important in your municipality. This statement should also outline the priority indicators for your municipality. This can be copied from the executive summary of your climate change plan. The second section from your climate change plan that you can copy directly into your IDP are the chapters for each sector. The Let's Respond Toolkit template has been developed in such a way that the sector summaries and projects can be copied directly into the relevant sector chapters of your IDP. Now that you've checked your IDP for climate change credibility, the second step of this integration process is to ensure that climate change response projects are included in the service delivery and budget implementation plan, as well as the medium-term expenditure framework budget allocations. Ideally, you will have had input from the municipal treasury during your stakeholder consultation process when you were developing your climate change plan. However, the actual drafting of the SDBIP is when the budget for the project is formally agreed to. This is a crucial step in the process because without a budget allocation, your projects will not be funded. If you have done this already, it is a good idea at this stage to ensure that the projects and responses in your climate change plan are discussed by the sector departments while they're finalizing their sections of the SDBIP. The third step of the IDP integration process is to ensure that the climate change components of the IDP are communicated to the public during the IDP consultation processes. It's important to keep stakeholders informed to help with getting buy-in and broader support for municipal activities. It also helps the community to realize their role in the overall municipal response to climate change. The final step in the IDP integration process focuses on project implementation and monitoring. Allocating clear roles and responsibilities, setting timeframes, and identifying measurements of success are crucial in implementation as well as monitoring of projects. It may be possible to set up an internal climate change committee that tracks the implementation of projects. It is also possible that projects are included as part of the performance management plan of sector managers. Clear measurements of success would need to be identified early on so that the effectiveness of the projects can be monitored. Paying attention to the actual implementation process of projects will ensure that climate change risk is minimized and adaptation takes place to the key climate change vulnerabilities you have in your area. Once you have gone through those 4 steps, you will have integrated climate change into your IDP. Ensuring climate change is well integrated into the IDP is an important part of responding to climate change. If projects are included in the IDP, you'll be able to secure a budget, and the implementation of the projects will be monitored through the IDP process. Your climate change plan then is likely to be a success, and you will begin to effectively respond to climate change. This video will take you through the stakeholder engagement process, which is the next crucial step in the development of your plan, as it ensures that the right people participate and provide input into your climate change planning process. So firstly, why do we need to engage with stakeholders? To start with, it's important to remember that South Africa's Constitution has a very strong focus on involving stakeholders in the matters of local government. To quote from Section 152, the objectives of local government are to encourage the involvement of communities as well as community organizations in the matters of local government. Consultation is also the very first of the 8 Batupele principles that aim at improving service delivery by putting people first. The consultation principle states, citizens should be consulted about the level and quality of the public services they receive, and wherever possible, should be given a choice about the services that they are offered. Besides these principles, stakeholder engagement is important because the more people who input into the plan, the better the contents will be. Stakeholders often bring a new idea that you may not have thought about. If you consult many stakeholders, it is also more likely that your plan will align with other internal and external processes. For example, you might find that some stakeholders you consult will mention a biodiversity plan that you weren't aware of. You can then make sure the main elements of the biodiversity plan are included in your climate change response plan. Stakeholder engagement, therefore, is not only a legislative requirement, but it can also improve the content of your plan with new ideas and ensure that linkages with other processes are made. The first step in a stakeholder engagement process is to identify your stakeholders. This gives you a clearer understanding of who you need to engage with. You can start by grouping stakeholders into broad categories. This can help to ensure that you don't leave any key stakeholders out. 4 stakeholder categories have been identified in this program. The first is the local government category, which includes councillors, IDP officials, and different sector officials. The second category is the other governments. This category includes local, provincial, and national government bodies. The third is the non-government groups category, which should include various NGOs operating within the different sectors. The fourth category is the public. This category includes private companies, community organizations, and any active individuals. Once you have an idea of the different stakeholder categories, the next step is to try and identify specific people who you can communicate with directly as you carry the planning process forward. We're going to briefly look at the steps that can assist you with this process. When identifying local government stakeholders, you first need to identify who your climate change champions are. These are key municipal officials who will carry this process forward and assist you with the consolidation of information for the climate change response plan. You will also need to confirm who the different sector managers are in your municipality. These are important role players who you will need to work with very closely, especially in the IDP integration phase. Some of the sectors to consider include agriculture, biodiversity and environment, disaster management, human settlements, health, and water. When identifying other government stakeholders, it is important to consider relevant government departments at a provincial and at a national level, as well as government associations such as the South African Local Government Association, also known as SALGA. You also need to think of specific government sector bodies such as the Department of Water and Sanitation, Department of Water Affairs, Agriculture, and so forth. These stakeholders can either be at provincial government, at national government, as well as at local government level. When identifying non-government group stakeholders, it is useful to consider the different sectors that are impacted by climate change, and then try to identify NGOs which are actively working in these sectors in your area. Consider agriculture, for example. Are there any NGOs that are working with small-scale farmers in your area? Then you'd need to include those. You can then begin to do a similar assessment for the rest of the sectors. The final category is the public. These are stakeholders who may be interested in the process and would like to be kept informed or updated. Some of the stakeholders might even have a level of involvement in the sectors you're developing plans for. This group could include private companies operating in the area, different community organizations, and active individuals who might have an interest in the climate change adaptation and planning processes. An important process to follow as you identify stakeholders is to start compiling a stakeholder database containing all your stakeholder information and contact details. This makes it easy for you to track your stakeholders and also ensure that you have representation from the different categories as well as sectors. A stakeholder database template can be downloaded from the Let's Respond Toolkit website. As you can see, this sheet has columns for stakeholder name, their surname, the position, type of stakeholder, as well as the contact details for all the identified stakeholders. You can customize this sheet by either adding other new columns or tabs based on the type of information you want to track. You can begin populating the information in your stakeholder database as you go along with the process of developing a climate change plan. For local and other government stakeholders, you can start by adding the details of specific individuals from various forums and meeting lists. You can then use a similar approach for non-government groups using meeting and forum registers as well as databases as a start. For the private sector, there may be a business environmental forum that operates in the area. You would then include those. Obtaining information for general public stakeholders may not be as easy as the other groups, and you might need to use more creative avenues, such as including community meeting attendees in your database or advertising for individuals to register on the project's database. An example is what eThekwini municipality did when they were developing their climate change strategy. The municipality published an advert in their local newspaper inviting stakeholders interested in the development of a climate change strategy for Durban to register on a project database. Stakeholders could register by either email or SMS. eThekwini Municipality was then able to update their database with interested public stakeholders. Once you've identified your stakeholders and begun populating your stakeholder database, the next step is to identify how you want to communicate with your stakeholders. It's important to keep in mind that different stakeholder groups need to be engaged with in different ways. You'll recall from earlier that we grouped our stakeholders into different categories of local government, other government, non-government groups, and public. You will need to identify the most effective ways of communicating with these different stakeholder groups. For example, you could use a presentation or rather a written report depending on who you're communicating with. For communicating with local governments, it may be best to do a presentation at existing forums or structures. You can summarize your climate change plan into a PowerPoint presentation and consider existing structures such as council, portfolio, or sector meetings, for example. There may be a regular municipal human settlements meeting and other internal municipal communication platforms that exist. For other government groups, a written report may be the best way to get your message across. You may consider distributing reports to existing structures such as SALGA and COCTA, or other intergovernmental platforms. For non-government groups, it may be more effective to communicate using a combination of presentations and reports depending on the stakeholder. For example, you may consider circulating reports to key civil society stakeholders presenting at community meetings for further input. Lastly, for communicating with the public, you may consider a range of communication tools. You could use presentations at public meetings or make use of the existing communication tools at municipalities such as newspapers or websites. You could also consider communicating more broadly through social media pages such as Facebook and Twitter, publishing requests for stakeholder comments in newspapers, or even start a competition with schools. We have now gone through the different types of stakeholders and the different ways you can communicate with your stakeholders. Keep in mind that the main aim of engaging stakeholders is so that your plan is reflective of what is happening in your area. Having the right stakeholders providing input into your plan is crucial and will assist you with your climate change planning process. Also, raising awareness of climate change and the plan will also ensure greater support for the various climate change projects that you wish to implement in the future.